May 15, 1945. The smell of ash still hung over Germany as Paul Nitze walked through the corridors of Flensburg, his briefcase heavy with questions that could reshape the post-war world. The 38-year-old economist from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey had tracked down the most important prisoner of all, Albert Speer, Hitler's architect turned Minister of Armaments, the man who had kept the Nazi war machine running until its final gasping breath. Inside a converted schoolhouse stripped of everything but a wooden table and 2 chairs, Nitze would spend the next 7 days extracting secrets that would haunt American military planning for the next half-century. Speer sat with the composure of a man who had already written his own verdict. At 40 years old, he still carried himself with the meticulous bearing of an architect, his gaunt face betraying only the slightest tremor when Nitze opened his briefcase. The American economist had come with a singular mission: to understand how Germany had sustained its war production under the most devastating bombing campaign in human history. But what he would discover in that room would force him to confront an uncomfortable truth about America's own industrial might and the terrifying mathematics of total war. The first day began with pleasantries that neither man believed. Nitze had studied economics at Harvard before joining the investment bank, Dillon, Red & Company, but the war had transformed him into something else entirely. A strategist obsessed with the cold calculus of industrial capacity. He had reviewed thousands of bombing reports, walked through the rubble of Cologne and Essen, and interviewed dozens of German industrialists. Yet Speer was different. According to documentation from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey archives, Speer had performed what many Allied analysts considered impossible: increasing German armaments production even as British and American bombers turned German cities into moonscapes. "Tell me about 1942, Nitze said, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed the Krupp Steel Works in Essen, intact despite dozens of raids. Speer studied the image with what might have been nostalgia or regret. It was impossible to tell. Then he began to speak, and Nitze realized he was hearing the confession of a man who had mastered the art of industrial warfare. Speer explained how he had decentralized German production, scattering factories into caves, forests, and underground bunkers. He described the brutal efficiency of the slave labor system, the 12 million workers, many from concentration camps, who had been consumed by the Reich's industrial furnaces. He detailed how synthetic oil plants had been buried beneath mountains, how aircraft production had been dispersed into hundreds of small workshops, how the bombing had actually forced Germany to become more efficient by destroying obsolete plants and compelling rationalization. But as the hours stretched into days, Nitze began asking different questions. He wanted numbers, precise figures on tank production, aircraft output, ammunition expenditure. Speer provided them with an accountant's precision, and with each answer, a disturbing picture emerged. Germany, even at its peak in 1944, had been operating on a fraction of its theoretical capacity. The bombing had hurt, yes, but what had truly strangled the Reich was something else entirely: the absence of resources that America possessed in seemingly infinite quantities. By the 3rd day of interrogation, Nitze's notebook had become a ledger of industrial apocalypse. Speer had revealed production figures that contradicted every assumption the Strategic Bombing Survey had made. In 1944 alone, Germany had produced approximately 40,000 aircraft, a number that had actually increased from the previous year, despite the intensification of Allied bombing raids. The underground factories in the Harz Mountains, the dispersed workshops hidden in Bavarian forests, the midnight shifts worked by starving prisoners, all of it had combined to create a production miracle that defied conventional military wisdom. But it was never enough, Speer said on that Wednesday morning, his voice carrying a strange mixture of pride and despair. He pulled a cigarette from the pack Nitze had offered, his hands steady despite 7 days of relentless questioning. "You Americans never understood the fundamental problem. It wasn't that your bombs weren't effective. It was that your production made our production irrelevant." Nitze leaned forward, sensing they had reached the core of something profound. According to records maintained by the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, the Strategic Bombing Survey had been established in November 1944, specifically to assess whether the massive investment in strategic bombing, hundreds of thousands of airmen, thousands of aircraft, and billions of dollars, had actually shortened the war, Nitze's superiors wanted vindication for the bombing campaign. But Speer was offering something more disturbing, proof that the bombing, while devastating, had not been the decisive factor. The German minister began sketching figures on a piece of paper. In 1944, he explained, Germany had manufactured approximately 19,000 tanks and assault guns. The factories had worked with desperate efficiency, incorporating design improvements, standardizing parts, exploiting every innovation that scarcity forced upon them. German engineers had created the Panther tank, the Tiger tank, weapons that were technically superior to almost anything the Allies fielded, yet none of it had mattered. Do you know how many tanks America produced in 1944? Speer asked, looking up from his calculations. Nitze did know. He had reviewed the War Production Board statistics, but he remained silent, letting Speer continue. Over 17,000 medium tanks, over 29,000 light tanks, and that doesn't include the thousands of tank destroyers, armored cars, and half-tracks. You were outbuilding us 3-to-1 in armor alone. The numbers accumulated like an indictment. Speer detailed Germany's aircraft production against American output. 40,000 German planes in 1944 against 96,000 American aircraft. German submarine production against American destroyer escorts and Liberty ships. German synthetic rubber against American natural rubber imports. Every comparison revealed the same mathematical certainty. Germany had been fighting an opponent with an industrial base roughly 4 times larger, and that disparity had made victory impossible from the beginning. But it was the conversation about steel that crystallized everything. Speer explained that Germany's maximum steel production had reached approximately 28 million tons in 1944, achieved through superhuman effort and the exploitation of conquered territories. America, operating far from any bombing raids, had produced over 80 million tons of steel in the same year. The United States had built entire new steel mills during the war, while Germany struggled to repair damaged furnaces. Your strategic bombing hurt us, Speer admitted, his architect's precision now applied to the anatomy of defeat. It killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, destroyed our cities, and forced us to waste resources on air defense. But you could have achieved the same result by simply continuing to outproduce us. The bombing was unnecessary. You had already won the war in 1941 when you began your industrial mobilization. Nitze felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the interrogation room. Everything Speer said aligned with data Nitze had already seen, but hadn't fully synthesized. The strategic bombing survey would eventually conclude that strategic bombing had shortened the war, but sitting across from Speer, Nitze understood a more unsettling truth. America's overwhelming production capacity had been the true weapon of mass destruction. On the 4th day, Speer led Nitze through a verbal tour of Germany's underground industrial empire, a shadow economy that had operated beneath mountains and inside salt mines, invisible to Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The morning light filtered weakly through the schoolhouse windows as Speer described the Mittelwerk complex near Nordhausen, where V-2 rockets had been assembled by concentration camp prisoners in tunnels carved into the Harz Mountains. The facility had stretched for miles beneath the earth, a subterranean cathedral dedicated to weapons production. The bombing forced us to innovate, Speer explained, his tone suggesting he was discussing architectural achievements rather than industrial facilities built on slave labor and death. We moved Junkers aircraft production into tunnels near Kalle. We relocated ball-bearing production from Schweinfurt into dispersed workshops. We even planned to manufacture jet engines in salt caverns. He paused, then added with bitter irony, Your intelligence services photographed empty factory sites and assumed they had been destroyed. They never imagined we had simply moved underground. According to documentation later published in the Official History of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Speer's decentralization strategy had indeed complicated Allied targeting. By late 1944, German war production was scattered across thousands of locations, many impossible to detect from the air. Small workshops in Bavarian villages assembled aircraft components. Machine shops in Austria produced tank transmissions. The centralized factory complexes that had been the primary targets of the combined bomber offensive had been replaced by a distributed network that operated in darkness and desperation. Yet Nitze pressed on the fundamental contradiction. If Germany had been so successful at dispersing and protecting its production, why had the Reich collapsed? Speer's answer revealed the true nature of modern industrial warfare. The underground factories, he explained, were technically impressive but economically catastrophic. Every kilogram of material that had to be transported into tunnels represented wasted fuel. Every hour spent relocating machinery was an hour of lost production. Every slave laborer who died from exhaustion in the Mittelwerk had to be replaced, straining the concentration camp system beyond its already horrific capacity. "We were mining our own future," Speer said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The underground factories consumed resources we couldn't replace. We used steel to build tunnels that should have been used for tanks. We assigned engineers to design dispersed production systems instead of improving weapons. We became experts at hiding our weakness rather than correcting it." The conversation shifted to oil, and here Speer's facade of technical detachment finally cracked. Germany's synthetic oil plants had been the true vulnerability, the choke point that no amount of decentralization could overcome. The hydrogenation facilities at Leuna, Politz, and Brooks had been massive industrial complexes that couldn't be hidden underground. When the Allies had finally concentrated their bombing on oil production in May 1944, the results had been catastrophic for Germany. By September 1944, we had lost nearly 90% of our fuel production capacity, Speer admitted. Tank crews trained without fuel. Luftwaffe pilots were grounded because we couldn't spare gasoline for training flights. The synthetic rubber plants shut down. Our entire chemical industry depended on the same hydrogenation process. When you destroyed the oil plants, you destroyed everything. Nitze had reviewed the targeting data and knew the oil campaign's success, but hearing it confirmed by Speer added a grim validation. The Strategic Bombing Survey would later calculate that this concentrated attack on oil had achieved more in 6 months than 3 years of city bombing. Yet even this success was complicated by what Speer said next. "But America's oil production made the entire question academic," the German minister continued. "You were producing over 4.7 million barrels per day. We were trying to synthesize perhaps 25,000 barrels per day from coal. Even without bombing, we could never have competed." He gestured at the walls as if they represented the entire continent beyond. "You had Texas oil fields pumping crude while we pulverized coal in expensive chemical plants. The mathematics were impossible from the beginning." As the 4th day ended, Nitze walked back to his quarters with a lengthening shadow of doubt. The interrogation was revealing that victory had been overdetermined. America had won not through any particular strategy, but through sheer industrial superiority. The bombing campaign, the tactical innovations, even the general's brilliant maneuvers had all been footnotes to the fundamental equation of production capacity. The 5th day began with Speer's most disturbing revelations: the systematic exploitation of slave labor that had undergirded German war production. Outside, rain drummed against the windows of the Flensburg schoolhouse, providing a rhythmic backdrop to testimony that would eventually help convict Speer at Nuremberg. Nitze had known abstractly about the concentration camp labor system, but Speer's clinical description of its industrial organization revealed a bureaucratic horror that transcended individual atrocities. "At peak, we employed approximately 12 million foreign workers and prisoners," Speer stated, consulting notes he had maintained even in captivity. 7.5 million civilian forced laborers from occupied territories, 2 million prisoners of war, approximately 2.5 million concentration camp inmates and other prisoners. He recited these figures with the same precision he had used to describe steel production, as if human beings were simply another resource to be allocated and consumed. Nitze had prepared questions about labor productivity and industrial efficiency, but sitting across from the architect of this system, the academic language felt obscene. Yet he pressed forward, because understanding the economics of slavery was essential to understanding why Germany had lost. Speer explained that concentration camp labor had been particularly crucial for the underground factories. At Mittelwerk, where V-2 rockets were assembled, approximately 60,000 prisoners had cycled through the facility, with roughly 20,000 dying from exhaustion, starvation, and brutal working conditions. The labor was inefficient, Speer admitted, displaying either remarkable cynicism or complete moral blindness. A starving prisoner produced perhaps one-third the output of a properly fed German worker. But we had prisoners in abundance and food in scarcity, so the mathematics worked, at least in the short term. He paused, then added, "Your American production system relied on well-fed, motivated workers operating efficient machinery. Ours relied on consuming human beings as if they were coal." According to testimony later documented in the Nuremberg trial transcripts, Speer had personally organized the labor allocation system that determined which prisoners went to which factories. He had negotiated with Heinrich Himmler over SS control of camp labor. He had visited factories where prisoners worked until they died, then were replaced with new shipments from Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen. His claim at Nuremberg that he hadn't known about the extermination program would be contradicted by his own meticulous records of labor allocation. But Nitze wasn't at Flensburg to prosecute war crimes. That would come later. He wanted to understand the industrial logic that had sustained Germany through 4 years of total war. Speer described how the labor system had enabled certain productions that would otherwise have been impossible. The underground factories required vast amounts of hand excavation. Dispersed production needed workers who could be moved quickly between locations. The repair of bombed facilities demanded crews that could be worked to death and replaced without concern for safety or welfare. Yet even with 12 million workers, we couldn't match American productivity, Speer continued, returning to his recurring theme. You had perhaps 65 million workers in war industries, but they were working with modern equipment, efficient processes, standardized parts. One American automotive worker produced more value than 3 German workers using our dispersed system, and you were feeding your workers proper meals while we were starving ours. The conversation revealed the paradox at the heart of the Nazi war economy. The regime's ideology demanded the exploitation and extermination of conquered peoples, yet this same exploitation undermined industrial efficiency. Every calorie denied to a slave laborer was a small reduction in output. Every skilled worker killed in the Holocaust was expertise that could never be replaced. Every resource devoted to the concentration camp system was a resource unavailable for weapons production. Nitze asked about specific industries. Speer detailed how aircraft production had increasingly relied on camp labor by late 1944. How tank production had shifted to facilities using prisoners. How ammunition plants had been staffed almost entirely by forced laborers. The entire German war economy had become addicted to slavery, creating a system that was simultaneously brutal and inefficient, morally monstrous and economically counterproductive. America had another advantage we could never replicate, Speer said, as the afternoon shadows lengthened. You had willing workers who believed in your cause. Our German workers were exhausted and demoralized. Our forced laborers sabotaged production whenever possible. Your factories hummed with patriotic purpose, while ours were guarded camps filled with resentment and death. As Nitze recorded these testimonies, he recognized that he was documenting not just the defeat of Nazi Germany, but the defeat of slavery as an industrial system. America's free labor economy had outproduced Germany's slave labor economy by orders of magnitude. The moral victory and the industrial victory had been the same victory, achieved not through virtue alone, but through the superior efficiency of human dignity. The 6th day marked a turning point in the interrogation. Speer stopped defending German achievements and began analyzing American industrial dominance with the admiration of an engineer confronting a masterpiece he could never replicate. Nitze had brought detailed production statistics from the War Production Board, and as he spread them across the interrogation table, Speer studied them with an intensity that suggested he was seeing the full scope of American power for the first time. The Liberty ships, Speer murmured, running his finger down a column of figures. You built 2,710 of them during the war. We knew you were building cargo ships quickly. But this... He looked up at Nitze with something approaching awe. Henry Kaiser's shipyards were launching a new ship every day at peak production. Our U-boat campaign was fighting mathematics, not just convoys. Nitze explained the American system that had made such production possible. The Liberty ships had been designed for rapid assembly using prefabricated sections and welding instead of riveting. Shipyards on the West Coast, the Gulf Coast, and the East Coast had all produced identical vessels using standardized blueprints. Workers had been trained in weeks rather than years, using modular construction techniques adapted from the automobile industry. The average construction time had dropped from 244 days in 1941 to 42 days by 1943. But it wasn't just ships, Nitze continued, pulling out more statistics. According to War Production Board data compiled in 1945, America had manufactured over 300,000 aircraft during the war, including 88,000 fighter aircraft and 35,000 heavy bombers. The numbers seemed almost abstract until Speer provided context from the German perspective. When our intelligence services reported these figures, we assumed they were propaganda exaggerations, Speer admitted. It seemed impossible that a nation could produce so much while maintaining its civilian economy. We were converting every factory to war production, scrapping civilian automobile manufacturing entirely, rationing everything. Yet you were producing war materials while still manufacturing consumer goods. The German minister was correct in his assessment. Unlike Germany, which had mobilized slowly for war and then consumed everything in the total war effort, America had expanded its industrial base rather than converting it. New factories had been built specifically for war production, while existing facilities continued modified civilian output. The American economy had grown by approximately 50% during the war years, an achievement Speer found almost incomprehensible. Nitze walked Speer through the automotive industry's transformation. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan had produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak operation. Chrysler had built tanks. General Motors had manufactured aircraft engines, trucks, and weapons. Yet these same companies had maintained enough civilian production to keep American society functioning. The infrastructure that had built millions of automobiles per year before the war had simply added war production on top of modified civilian manufacturing. The Ruhr Valley was our arsenal, Speer said, comparing Germany's industrial heart to America's dispersed manufacturing. But you had Detroit, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, Seattle, and a dozen other industrial centers, all operating beyond the range of any bomber we could build. Geography itself was your ally. The statistics accumulated into a portrait of overwhelming abundance. America had produced over 2.4 million military trucks during the war, more trucks than Germany had produced vehicles of all types. American steel mills had exceeded 80 million tons annually, while German production peaked below 30 million tons. American aluminum production had reached approximately 2 billion pounds per year, enabling all-metal aircraft construction that Germany could only dream about with its aluminum shortages. But what struck Speer most forcefully was America's rubber production. Before the war, 90% of the world's rubber had come from Southeast Asian plantations, which Japan had conquered in 1942. Germany had developed synthetic rubber production out of necessity, but the process was expensive and produced inferior material. America, faced with the same rubber shortage, had built a synthetic rubber industry from scratch that by 1945 was producing over 800,000 tons annually, more than the entire world's natural rubber production before the war. You had the resources, the technology, and the industrial organization, Speer summarized, pushing the statistics back across the table. You were fighting a different kind of war, one based on abundance rather than scarcity. We learned to do more with less. You learned to do everything with more. Your submarines, your tanks, your aircraft, they were adequate rather than exceptional. But you had so many of them that quality became irrelevant. Nitze felt uncomfortable with this assessment even as he recognized its accuracy. American weapons had generally been reliable rather than revolutionary. The Sherman tank was inferior to German Panthers and Tigers. The P-51 Mustang was a superb fighter, but German jets were faster. Yet America had produced 50,000 Shermans and 15,000 Mustangs, overwhelming technological superiority through numerical dominance. As the sixth day ended, both men understood they had been discussing not just industrial production, but the fundamental nature of American power. The seventh and final day of interrogation began with Speer's most critical assessment, his judgment of German strategic decisions and why they had failed to counter American industrial might. The rain had cleared overnight, and morning sunlight illuminated the interrogation room with an almost accusatory brightness. Nitze sensed that Speer, after 6 days of detailed testimony, was ready to articulate conclusions he had reached while watching the Reich collapse around him. Hitler never understood industrial warfare, Speer began, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had spent years trying to make a fundamentally flawed system function. He thought of production in terms of individual weapons, the tank, the submarine, the jet aircraft. He never grasped that modern war is fought with systems of production, logistics networks, and resource allocation. Your Roosevelt and your War Production Board understood this from the beginning. Nitze asked about specific strategic decisions that might have changed the outcome. Speer was candid. Nothing could have changed the fundamental mathematics of industrial capacity. Germany's decision to delay full mobilization until 1942 had been catastrophic. But even full mobilization from 1939 wouldn't have matched American potential. The conquest of France and the Low Countries had provided resources and factories, but these were offset by occupation costs and resistance movements. The invasion of the Soviet Union was our death sentence, Speer stated with clinical certainty. Not because of military defeats, though those were inevitable, but because it committed us to a two-front war against two enemies who each possessed larger industrial bases than we did. America alone outproduced us 4-1. The Soviet Union, despite barbaric destruction, still outproduced us in tanks and artillery. We were fighting combined opponents with perhaps 7 or 8 times our industrial capacity. According to analyses later published by the Strategic Bombing Survey, Speer's assessment was mathematically accurate. The combined industrial output of the United States, Soviet Union, and British Empire had exceeded Axis production by factors that made strategic victory impossible. Germany, Japan, and Italy together had produced approximately 300,000 aircraft during the war. The Allies had produced over 650,000. The disparity in every category, ships, tanks, trucks, ammunition, told the same story. Speer then addressed the strategic bombing campaign that Nitze had come to evaluate. Your bombing hurt us tremendously, he acknowledged, but not in the ways your Air Force claimed. The destruction of cities didn't break morale. It often strengthened resistance. The killing of civilians created rage rather than submission. What the bombing did accomplish was force us to waste resources on air defense and dispersal that should have gone to offensive weapons. He detailed the enormous costs of Germany's air defense system. By 1944, approximately 1 million Germans were manning anti-aircraft guns that could have been employed as anti-tank weapons on the Eastern Front. Fighter aircraft that could have supported ground operations were instead defending German cities. Scarce fuel was allocated to interceptors rather than tanks. The bombing didn't destroy German production so much as it forced Germany to produce the wrong things. But here's what your strategic bombing survey should conclude, Speer said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. The bombing was unnecessary. You won the war in Detroit and Pittsburgh, not over Germany's skies. Every bomber that attacked our cities represented enormous resources: the aircraft, the fuel, the trained crews. You could have won faster by simply building more cargo ships and tanks instead of bombers. Nitze challenged this conclusion. Hadn't the oil campaign of mid-1944 been decisive? Hadn't the destruction of transportation networks paralyzed German logistics? Speer conceded these points but maintained his central thesis. America's overwhelming production had made every German countermeasure futile. Even if the bombing had never occurred, Germany would have been buried under the weight of American and Soviet production. We made errors, Speer continued, cataloging failures. We should have prioritized anti-aircraft defense earlier. We should have developed the jet fighter in 1942 instead of 1944. We should have focused on submarines and defensive weapons rather than offensive systems we couldn't sustain. But none of it would have mattered. You can't defeat an opponent who outproduces you 4-1, especially when that opponent is protected by 2 oceans. The conversation turned philosophical in its final hour. Speer spoke of how Hitler's ideology had undermined industrial efficiency, the persecution of Jewish scientists, the conquest policies that alienated potential allies, the racial theories that wasted resources on extermination camps. Every aspect of Nazi ideology had created industrial inefficiencies that America's more pragmatic system avoided. Your country mobilized women for war production while we insisted they stay home, Speer noted. You integrated your economy with Allied production while we exploited conquered territories. You treated prisoners of war according to Geneva Conventions while we worked them to death. Every ideological decision we made reduced our industrial capacity, while every practical decision you made increased yours. As the seventh day ended, Nitze packed his notebooks with a profound unease. He had come to validate strategic bombing, but had instead discovered that American victory had been overdetermined by factors that preceded the first bomber raid. The interrogation of Albert Speer had revealed that America's true weapon of mass destruction was not the bomb, but the factory. September 9th, 1945. Paul Nitze sat in a Pentagon conference room, 4 months after completing the Speer interrogation, preparing to brief senior military officials on the Strategic Bombing Survey's preliminary findings. Outside, Washington sweltered in late summer heat, but inside the air-conditioned offices of the War Department, a chill of different sort was settling over the assembled officers. They had expected vindication for the billions of dollars spent on strategic bombing. What Nitze was about to deliver was far more complicated. General Henry Hap Arnold sat at the head of the conference table, his expression already guarded. The commanding general of the Army Air Forces had staked his career on strategic bombing theory, the belief that aerial bombardment could break enemy industrial capacity and morale, winning wars without massive ground campaigns. Around him sat colonels and majors who had planned the combined bomber offensive, men who had sent thousands of aircrews to their deaths over German cities. They wanted proof their sacrifices had mattered. Gentlemen, Nitze began, opening the leather folder that contained his 7 days of notes from the Speer interrogation. I need to present findings that contradict some of our assumptions about strategic bombing's effectiveness. He could feel the temperature in the room drop further. According to War Department records later archived at the National Archives, this briefing would become one of the most contentious meetings of the post-war assessment period. Nitze walked the assembled officers through Speer's revelations. Germany's armaments production had increased through 1944, despite the intensification of bombing raids. The decentralization and dispersal strategies had been remarkably effective. Underground factories had continued producing weapons even as cities above them burned. The bombing had certainly damaged German capacity, but it hadn't achieved the decisive industrial collapse that pre-war bombing theorists had predicted. Then what did win the war? General Arnold asked, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. Nitze's answer would reshape American military planning for the next decade. Production, sir. Overwhelming, systematic, organized production. The United States manufactured approximately 40% of all military equipment produced by all combatants during the entire war. We outbuilt Germany 4-1, Japan by even larger margins. The bombing hurt them, but our factories buried them. He presented the comparative statistics. American aircraft production versus German, American shipbuilding versus German U-boat construction, American aluminum output versus German shortages. Every metric told the same story. The Strategic Bombing Survey would ultimately conclude that bombing had shortened the war. But sitting in that Pentagon conference room, Nitze was revealing that the margin of American industrial superiority had been so vast that traditional military strategy had become almost irrelevant. A colonel from Air Force intelligence challenged the implications. Are you suggesting we wasted resources on strategic bombing? Nitze chose his words carefully, knowing they would be weighed against careers and reputations. I'm suggesting that American victory was overdetermined by industrial capacity. The bombing was effective, particularly the oil campaign and transportation attacks in 1944. But we could have achieved similar results through alternative strategies that didn't require such enormous investments in heavy bombers. The room erupted into arguments that would continue for months. Air Force advocates would point to specific successes: the destruction of synthetic oil plants, the collapse of German transportation, the diversion of resources to air defense. Critics would cite the enormous cost in aircraft and trained crews, the limited effectiveness of area bombing against morale, the questionable contribution of city attacks to military victory. But beneath these tactical debates, Nitze had introduced a more profound concern. If America's industrial superiority had been the decisive factor against Germany, a sophisticated industrial power, what did that mean for future conflicts? Speer had revealed that even a totalitarian state with slave labor and ruthless exploitation couldn't match American production. The implications were simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. "There's something else, gentlemen," Nitze continued, pulling out a separate set of notes. Minister Speer made an observation that should concern us regarding future conflicts. He said that America's industrial advantage exists only when we have time to mobilize it. A future enemy who could strike our industrial base directly, who could hit Detroit and Pittsburgh and Seattle before we mobilize, could neutralize our advantage. The room fell silent as officers contemplated the implications. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had already introduced a new dimension to warfare. Combined with Nitze's revelations about the primacy of industrial capacity, a dark picture emerged. Future wars might be won or lost in the first hours, before American factories could gear up their overwhelming production. General Arnold stood, signaling the meeting's end. "Your report will be controversial, Mr. Nitze. Make sure every conclusion is supported by evidence. We need to understand what actually won this war before we plan how to win the next one." As the officers filed out, several approached Nitze with questions that revealed their anxiety. Everything they had believed about military strategy was being revised in light of the Speer interrogation and the comparative production data. By 1946, as the Strategic Bombing Survey completed its final report, Paul Nitze had become one of the most influential strategists in Washington, a position that would lead him eventually to become Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and an architect of Cold War containment strategy. But it was the 7 days with Albert Speer in Flensburg that had crystallized his understanding of modern power. Everything that followed, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the nuclear strategy debates, would reflect lessons learned in that converted schoolhouse. The Strategic Bombing Survey's final report, published in September 1946, attempted to balance competing interpretations. It concluded that strategic bombing had been effective, particularly in its later phases when focused on oil and transportation. It credited the bombing campaign with reducing German production by approximately 25% below what it might otherwise have been. It noted the diversion of German resources to air defense. Yet running through the report like a subtext was Nitze's fundamental insight. American production capacity had been the decisive strategic factor. Speer himself would eventually testify at Nuremberg, where his candid admissions and apparent remorse would save him from the death penalty. He received 20 years in Spandau prison, using that time to write memoirs that would reinforce his image as the good Nazi, who had opposed Hitler's most destructive orders, an image that historians would later challenge as carefully constructed self-mythology. But the testimony he gave to Nitze remained one of the most accurate assessments of why Germany had lost. According to analyses published in the Journal of Military History decades later, the Nitze-Speer interrogation revealed fundamental truths about industrial warfare that shaped post-war military planning. America's defense establishment learned that technological sophistication mattered less than production volume, that free labor outproduced slave labor, that geographic security allowing uninterrupted production was perhaps the greatest strategic advantage, that wars between industrial powers would be won by nations who could sustain higher production over longer periods. These lessons influenced Cold War planning in profound ways. When Nitze helped design the strategy of containment, he assumed that American industrial capacity would ultimately overwhelm Soviet production, just as it had overwhelmed Germany. The Marshall Plan represented an application of the same logic, rebuilding European industrial capacity to create a production base that Soviet expansion couldn't match. Nuclear weapons added terrifying complexity, but the underlying assumption remained. American industrial power, if mobilized and protected, could outproduce any rival. Yet the Speer interrogation had also revealed the limits and contradictions of American power. Overwhelming production required resources, labor, capital, and time. It required political consensus that could sustain mobilization. It required geographic security that atomic weapons might eliminate. Speer had been correct that Germany couldn't match American production, But what about an enemy who struck before America could mobilize? What about an opponent who could reach American factories with intercontinental bombers or missiles? These questions would haunt Nitze through decades of Cold War strategy debates. He would become an advocate for civil defense, for dispersal of American industry, for early warning systems and strategic deterrence, all attempts to protect the industrial base that Speer had identified as America's ultimate weapon. When he served in the Reagan administration in the 1980s, pushing for military buildup and negotiating arms control treaties, he was still applying lessons from those 7 days in May 1945. The American automotive industry that had built tanks and bombers would eventually face different challenges. Competition from Japanese and German industries rebuilt with American assistance, economic transformations that would hollow out Detroit and Pittsburgh, globalization that would disperse production across continents. The industrial power that had seemed so permanent in 1945 would prove vulnerable to economic forces that military planning hadn't anticipated. Albert Speer died in London on September 1, 1981, while traveling to promote his final memoir. Paul Nitze would live until October 19, 2004, serving 10 presidents and remaining influential in defense policy until his final years. The Strategic Bombing Survey reports they had created together, interrogator and subject, remained classified in parts until the 21st century, their full insights obscured by military secrecy and bureaucratic caution. But the fundamental lesson endured. In the war that destroyed Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, America's overwhelming production capacity had been the decisive weapon. Not the brilliant generals, not the brave soldiers, not even the strategic bombing campaign, but the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, and the refineries of Texas. The Nitze interrogation of Speer had revealed that modern industrial war was ultimately a contest of production, and America in 1945 had possessed a production capacity unmatched in human history. The 7 days in Flensburg had transformed both men's understanding of power. Speer had arrived at the interrogation as the architect who had kept Hitler's war machine running against impossible odds. He left having articulated the mathematics of his own defeat, having explained with precision why German ingenuity, slave labor, and totalitarian efficiency had been insufficient against American industrial abundance. His testimony had been simultaneously a confession and an analysis, revealing both the crimes of the Nazi system and the futility of its economic strategy. Nitze had arrived as an economist seeking to validate strategic bombing. He left with a more profound and troubling insight, that American power rested not on any particular weapon or strategy, but on an industrial base that could outproduce all rivals combined. This realization would inform every strategic decision he made over the next 6 decades. When he helped craft NSC-68 in 1950, calling for massive military buildup to contain Soviet expansion, he was applying Speer's lesson about the primacy of production capacity. When he negotiated arms control treaties in the 1980s, he was trying to manage the nuclear dangers that had made industrial mobilization potentially irrelevant. The interrogation room in Flensburg had been the site where World War II's true nature had been revealed, not in the moment of surrender, but in the calm accounting that followed. 2 men, victor and vanquished, had examined the economic anatomy of the greatest conflict in human history and discovered that it had been decided not by courage or strategy, but by steel tonnage, aircraft production rates, and synthetic rubber output. The bombs had fallen, the soldiers had fought, the generals had planned. But the factories had won. In the decades that followed, historians would debate every aspect of the Strategic Bombing Survey's conclusions. Some would argue that Nitze had underestimated bombing's effectiveness, that the destruction of German cities had achieved psychological and economic effects beyond what production statistics revealed. Others would claim that even the survey's qualified endorsement of strategic bombing had been too generous, that the entire campaign had been a costly diversion from more effective strategies. The debates would continue through generations of military historians and strategists, but none could dispute the central revelation from the Speer interrogation. America in 1945 had commanded an industrial capacity so vast that it had rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. The United States had fought a 2-ocean war, supplied allies across the globe, maintained civilian prosperity, and still outproduced the combined Axis powers by margins that made their defeat mathematically certain. Speer had recognized this truth even as he had worked desperately to defy it, and Nitze had documented it with the precision of an economist cataloging the anatomy of absolute victory. As the 20th century progressed, the nature of power would transform. Economic competition would replace military conquest. Information technology would revolutionize production. Globalization would disperse manufacturing across continents. The industrial dominance that America had wielded in 1945 would fragment and evolve into more complex forms of economic power. Yet the fundamental lesson remained relevant. In contests between modern industrial nations, production capacity determined outcomes more surely than any other factor. The schoolhouse in Flensburg, where Nitze and Speer had spent 7 days in May 1945, would eventually be demolished, replaced by post-war construction as Germany rebuilt. No plaque would mark where the interrogation had occurred. No memorial would note the conversations that had taken place there. But the insights generated in those 7 days would echo through decades of strategic planning, influencing decisions about military spending, industrial policy, alliance structures, and nuclear strategy. Paul Nitze's notebooks from the interrogation, eventually declassified and archived at the Library of Congress, would become primary sources for understanding both the Nazi war economy and the American strategic assessment that followed victory. Scholars would mine them for details about German production, about Speer's role in slave labor exploitation, about the effectiveness of bombing campaigns. But the most important content was the revelation running through every page, that America had possessed such overwhelming industrial superiority that the outcome of World War II had never been in serious doubt once American production reached full capacity. Albert Speer's testimony at Nuremberg would reference many of the same themes he had discussed with Nitze: the impossibility of matching Allied production, the waste of resources on ideological projects, the ultimate futility of German resistance. His 20 years in Spandau prison would give him time to refine these arguments into memoirs that portrayed him as a technocrat who had tried to rationalize an irrational system. Later, historians would challenge this self-serving narrative, documenting his direct involvement in slave labor and his knowledge of the Holocaust. But his analysis of why Germany lost, because America's industrial capacity had been insurmountable, remained accurate regardless of his moral failures. The final irony was that both Germany and Japan, the nations whose industrial capacity America had overwhelmed and then destroyed, would eventually rebuild with American assistance to become economic powerhouses themselves. The Marshall Plan and post-war reconstruction would apply American resources to creating industrial competitors, a strategy that made sense only in the context of Cold War containment. The industrial capacity that had defeated the Axis powers would be partially transferred to former enemies to create a barrier against Soviet expansion. 7 days in May 1945 had revealed the decisive factor in history's greatest war. A young American economist and a defeated German minister had sat across a wooden table and dissected the mathematics of industrial warfare. What they discovered there, that overwhelming production capacity had been America's ultimate weapon, would shape strategic thinking for generations. The bombers had flown, the armies had fought, the navies had clashed across 2 oceans. But in the end, the war had been won in the factories, and the 7 days in Flensburg had proved it beyond doubt.